1993 was the 30th anniversary of Doctor Who. The show wasn't on the air at the time, but still the BBC had a vested interest in keeping it alive. They had, initially, promised a feature-length multi-Doctor extravaganza called Lost in the Dark Dimension. For various reasons, partially money, partially BBC politics, and, well, allegedly partially behind-the-scenes disputes between certain people about who got what lion's share of the dialogue, Lost in the Dark Dimension never made it to the screens. Instead, we got a 2-episode charity skit called Dimensions in Time. It's never been released commercially because of rights issues, as it was a charity skit, but there are copies of it on YouTube. Dimensions in Time has gone down in fandom as one of those things. It was a lovely idea, and it was boosted by the BBC trying to film it in a certain type of 3D. But yes, the expanded universe doesn't really count Dimensions in Time as canon. In fact, one of the books explicitly states it's a dream. Of course, expanded universe stuff doesn't really count for much these days, and if you were watching the most recent series of Doctor Who very carefully, you'll have actually seen stills from Dimensions in Time appear on the screen. That's because the principal villain was the Rani. Normally in Doctor Who, when the Rani, or the Master, or the Monk, or whoever turns up, they're usually working on their own. But in Dimensions in Time, the Rani was given her own companion. Played by Samuel West, the character was never named on screen, but earned the nickname Shag amongst certain fans. Not sure if that's because that's what they thought the Rani was doing, or because that's what they wanted to do. Although it was never novelised, presumably for the same contractual reasons as its non-release, the BBC did eventually release an official prequel to it, in which we find out how the Rani ended up travelling with Sirian. From the 1995 Doctor Who yearbook, the story Rescue, written by Dimensions in Time writer David Rodan, tells us what Sirian was facing just before the Rani collected him. It's up to you to decide whether a lifetime travelling with the Rani is better or worse than the fate the universe seemingly had in store for him. Rescue by David Rodan. Bubbling, evil grey clouds hung heavily in the shunting steel sky, and distant arcs of stars speckled through the breaks in the low cloud. Chill and forlorn. This monotonous sky slithered across the surface of the planet. The planet was recorded in star charts as DV Acrol 8. Never visited, always skirted round by travellers. Not surprising, since the surface of the planet was an ever-shifting sea of cold grey sand. No life flourished in this waterless desert, ever had done, or ever would do. A small planet. 84 billion blighted square miles of rock. Such was the unfriendly desolation that the lightning-like flashes of explosions on the horizon would have astounded any bystander. Nobody ever comes to DV Acrol 8, do they? For the first time in the planet's lonely existence, a foot crunched down into the crystals of sand. A metallic and plastic boot, encrusted with dried hydraulic fluid, lifted once more, sand pouring from it, and took an agonized step forwards. And another, and another. Then it stopped. The explosions in the distance seemed to be nearing the lone figure. Balls of flame rolled across the desert, throwing up dark grey sand in a frenzied storm behind. The explosions were getting too close for comfort. The figure stared in emotionless disregard at the encroaching turmoil. Something was following in the wake of the explosions. A large figure shrouded by the trailing sandstorm. Occasional flashes of intense white light bored through the thick swirl of dust. It wasn't just a large figure. It was enormous. A giant machine. As the explosions came ever closer, heat waves radiated from the white-hot flames, and the machine behind grew ever more distinct. And then the figure caught his first glimpse of this thing. A titanic metal snake coiled its way across the shifting desert. Its ribbed silver body was crayoned with splashes of orange rust that creaked and flaked as the thing heaved and twisted. The thick, bulbous head of the machine, dimpled with jagged striations, swung from side to side. The intense white lights at the front momentarily took on the appearance of two colliding suns, and a brief blaze of incandescent liquid spat from the machine's head, thumping into the sand hot and heavy. The explosion tore a chunk out of the desert, hurled it high into the air, and then there was silence. An ominous rain of sand drifted back to the surface like black snow, silhouetted against the flare of the machine's eyes. The machine froze, just for the briefest of moments, as if it was searching, listening, hunting out something. Something it could not quite find, just yet. The creature's prey had been standing watching its high-speed slide across the desert. It now turned and began to walk away from the thing, back up the shifting hillside. The sand slithered and spilled underneath his feet. A crippled leg slowed his escape, and he brutally forced himself to quicken his pace, straining as he thrust his twisted right leg in front of him. The tails of his leather coat flapped in the hot wind, whipping and blowing around his legs. He clutched at his wide-brimmed hat with a gnarled hand, pulling the brim down over his eyes to shield them from the stinging sand. Another painful step, and one more. He could never outrun the thing. He knew that. He had no illusions about his own mortality, but while he still kept going, he had a chance. Desperate thoughts of escape flitted through his feverish brain, and he clutched protectively at the inside pocket of his coat. Thankfully, the hard, cylindrical shape of his radio was still there. He could feel the dull thump of its regular electronic heartbeat, the beat of the Mayday signal it was sending out into deepest space. Someone must pick up the signal soon. Someone, anyone. They had to, for his sake. The groan of ancient metal twisting up on itself made the figure turn to look over his shoulder. The machine snake was swaying on its hind portions, casting its head from side to side. He didn't have much time. It would sense his presence soon. And then it happened. The snake reared even further back, then nosedived into the sand. Within seconds, the creature had buried the front half of its metal body, then began elongating and contracting the remainder. Sluggishly, the metal creature disappeared from view, sliding into the ground, throwing up a cylindrical cascade of dry sand in its wake. The figure paused in trepidation, his pulse beating rapidly in his forehead. Rumblings in the ground beneath him froze him to the spot. He daren't move. What if the creature sensed his surface movements, however small? He inhaled slowly and deeply. The back of his sweaty hand shakily wiped grit across his equally wet brow. Dare he risk a step? Should he make an attempt at escape? His eyes narrowed and swept the forlorn desert. There was complete stillness. Only the wind. The thing must have burrowed its way under the surface and then crawled to a standstill. He strained to search the contours of the landscape, but could see no telltale moving humps under the sand. Maybe this was his chance. Would he run, and then the waiting creature pounce? His heart thumped in anticipation. He could stand there all day waiting for action from his hunter. He had to make the first move. He had to. His name was Sirian, a refugee from Galveston, the plague-ridden asteroid neighbor of DV Acrol 8. He was lucky that his crippled spaceship had limped this far. Had his life really amounted to this? Aggrieved, he took stock of his lot. Stranded on an alien planet and about to run for all he was worth. He began to hobble up the drifting ash-grey hillside, hauling his shattered leg behind him, indifferent to the searing pain. He staggered on, a man possessed, a man frightened and angry at his present situation. The bitter, gritty wind scorched his face, its intensity rising as he neared the crest of the hill. Through painful, laboured breaths, he finally drew himself up to the summit of the sandbank and paused, standing astride the top. Rasping and rattling breaths of relief issued from his pallid, cracked lips. Each time he breathed, his mouth filled with sand and his eyes were clamped tightly shut as the stinging wind moaned all around him. His wrinkled brown leather hand reached up to cover his nose and mouth, and he coughed and spluttered muddy saliva into his palm. He could hardly move now, transfixed in the biting crosswinds etched against the rolling black sky. A colossal tower of metal exploded upwards out of the sand, literally meters from where he was standing, and reared up into the clouds. A thick rain of sand cascaded back down onto him, and the ground buckled beneath his feet. The snake twisted to and fro, its giant eyes searching for its lost prey. Pinned down in the glare of its magnesium-like eyes, he panicked, and in an instant of sudden and senseless impulsiveness, he lurched into action and staggered away back down the hillside. As he ran, his feet skidded and sank into the sand, throwing up great dry fans of dust as he kicked his feet free. The dimpled muzzle of the creature raised itself heavenwards, and tiny, heat-scarred panels slid back to reveal torpedo tubes. Within seconds, the machine's nose had blasted 8 cylinders up and out of the tubes, amidst a savage burst of flame. The caskets, all of them about 7 or 8 feet in length, were catapulted high into the venomous sky, twisted on their ends, and then toppled back to the earth, gouging great chunks out of the hillside as they whined and whistled to the ground. Several of them sank, burying themselves under the sliding sand, whilst others skated across the surface, spinning round and round until they slowed to a halt. Sirian saw none of this. He was running blind into the wind. He heard the explosions, the dull thumps, and behind him, one of the cylinders sent up a great spray as it too buried itself under the sand. The other cylinders began to nose their way into the ground, burrowing down, agitating the surface of the desert until they had all disappeared from sight. He ran on, his heart pummeling wildly against his chest. Sweat drenched his clothes and sand clung to him, drying on his leathery skin. The ground beneath his feet boiled and bubbled as the cylinders slid through the desert all around him. He was being surrounded on all sides, in front and behind. There was nowhere to run to. Each time he desperately changed direction, the cylinders burrowed after him. He turned again and again, ran on, turned, ran on, and still they pursued him. With a chillingly resigned cry of, "No!" Sirian finally sank to his knees. Laughing hysterically, he flung his hat from his head, and the wind carried it high into the thickening clouds. Come on, he screamed through gritted teeth. "Come on, I'm here, you can't miss me." He threw himself forward into the sand. Still laughing and scooping up handfuls of dust, he smeared his face, covered his hair, and lay writhing in the sand. His voice cracked and faltered, and he began to cry. Come on! Then suddenly all 8 cylinders simultaneously exploded vertically out of the ground, blossoming in midair, their outer shells crackling away to reveal the inhabitants inside. 8 giant silver figures dropped to the ground, landing deftly upright and on 2 powerful metal legs. Twisted and burnt shards of casing crashed back down to the ground about them. The Cybermen stood motionless. Sirian looked up through his fingers and saw the 8 Cybermen standing in a circle around him. They stood perfectly still, black electronic eyes watching him. These Cybermen were different to any he had seen before. They were somehow more robust looking. The arms were thicker with tubing and black protective shielding. Their legs appeared to have all the intricate interior workings exposed under clear plastiglass armor. Thick, articulated fingers clasped an organic-looking weapon, like the stem of a brain, with tendrils of tissue wrapped around the fingers. And the chest panel swept up to the neck and head amidst a convoluted mass of wires and veins, which all penetrated into the cyborg's brains through the ribbed gullet. They looked horribly human, almost a makeshift embryonic form riddled with electronic gadgetry. One of the Cybermen spoke, rasping and guttural, the speech formed by electronic signals from its voice box. "You will stand. Stand." Painfully drawing himself up, Sirian swayed on his shattered leg. "Leave me alone. Please." "Destroy him. Now," the leader intoned to his troops, and raised his gun, leveling it at his prey's chest. Digital crosswires focusing on him. "No! You must listen to me! Please!" He held his hands up in front of him, desperately trying to ward off the imminent laser blast. "Fire!" came the order. 8 Cybermen guns spat blazing fire. Magnesium blue bolts sliced burning holes in the figure's body. He twisted, spinning under the force of the impact. His leg gave way beneath him, and he toppled to the floor, greasy blood splattering the ground even before he hit the cold sand. There was a moment of silent anticipation. Sirian lay paralyzed in agony, coughing and wheezing, spluttering blood. Weakly he looked up into the sky, the clouds blurring and turning a bizarre shade of purple. His head pulsated with a dull, muzzy pain, and the desert seemed to lift up around him, turn upside down, and crash heavily onto his head. In the second before he passed out, he heard a sound he had never heard before. He didn't even have time to consider what the sound might be before darkness blissfully enfolded him. The sound accompanied a tremendous flash of light, a boiling inrush of stale air, and the ghostly vision of a spinning monolith rotating down through the frothing clouds. A lightning storm was whipping up about the stone pillar, crackling and lashing, carving a path through the blizzard of sand. The patrol of Cybermen were momentarily disorientated by the sudden appearance of the monolith as it descended from the sky in a shaft of incandescent light. The craft gently came to rest on the cold sand, only meters away from the fallen figure. The cyber leader was the first to recover. Although its sensors could not comprehend at first what the machine was, it knew it was almost certainly a danger to them and to their mission. "Destroy that craft. Destroy it at once." Yet again, 8 guns flashed with fire and bolts of raw energy sliced into the outer shell of the craft. The monolith stood unshaken and firm, laser bolts riding up and over the carved inscription on the top. The more shots that were fired, the less effect they seemed to have. The firestorm from the Cybermen's guns grew more and more intense, their sensors indicating that the machine was absorbing all energy directed at it and using it to deflect any further attack. The leader raised a tube-threaded hand. "Cease the attack." There was a pause, and the wind echoing across the desert landscape was the only sound to be heard. And then, in the moody silence, there came faint coughs and wheezes. The wounded Syrian, clutching his numbed head, was dragging his broken body across the sand. Towards the grey pillar. The machine signalled safety to him. Half in confusion and half by some innate instinct, he huddled himself at the foot of the monolith, waiting for the moment of final termination. "We require additional support," stated the leader, rasping electronically. The patrol turned to look behind them, and their digitized vision showed the machine snake riding up on its hind portions. With a creak of ancient warping metal, it began to coil and wind its way through the blizzard of sand towards the patrol. The leader swung its head back to face this newly arrived flying machine, just as a Catherine wheel of blue light exploded from the inscription on top of the pillar. Jagged fingers of electricity slammed into each member of the Cyber Patrol, catching them just above their eyes, flinging them backwards, limbs akimbo, into the sand. The force of the detonation took the top of the Cyber Leader's metal head off, and it staggered disorientated, hydraulic fluid pumping from shattered veins. Its remaining eye lazily focused on the monolith, vision turning to snowy distortion as the power to that area was redirected. It was plunged into darkness, and its heat-damaged computer brain's first reaction was to give the order to begin firing. The semi-organic gun in its hand suddenly began to spit fire, regardless of direction and target. In the confusion, a door in the base of the pillar gently opened, and a woman's hand reached out, took hold of the wounded Syrian's coat, and hauled him bodily back in through the open door. The Rani flicked her eyes one final time towards the damaged Cybermen and gave a wry smile, her eyes glittering with malicious intent. Then she faded into the shadows inside her TARDIS. The last thing one of the Cybermen saw were the prey's feet disappearing into the pillar and the door closing after them. The Cyberman didn't even have time to fire his gun into the closing gap, because his leader's flailing gun arm twisted in his direction and fired. A shower of molten sparks erupted from the Cyberman's chest unit, billowing apart the life support system in its midriff. Smoke poured from the gaping hole, tiny wires fizzing and crackling in the acrid void. The remaining Cybermen were left, half buried in the sand, shaking and jerking, their limbs palpitating with an electronic overload. Their leader staggered blindly amongst their fallen bodies, arms waving feverishly and gun firing indiscriminately into the air. It looked an eerie sight, silhouetted alone against the approaching glow of the machine snake's eyes, standing atop the crest of the grey hillside, battered by the ever-strengthening sandstorm. And then the air filled with electricity, snapping and crackling, lashing and pushing, as the monolith began to rotate back up into the clouds. It lifted away from the surface of the planet, sluggishly at first, gathering speed as it gained height. The giant cyber machine rose alarmingly quickly over the crest of the hill, crushing its own cyber patrol under its ribbed verinium underbelly. The machine loomed above the landscape, watching the craft streak up in front of it. The machine's eyes pulsed like suns, and within milliseconds, it had dispatched a bolt of burning liquid into the sky. The clouds fried as the shot passed through them, and it caught the underside of the rapidly disappearing craft, sending it spinning helter-skelter into the encroaching night sky. A hot rain of lime green fire fell back to the planet, bringing momentarily the first splashes of colour to Devi Akrol 8. But the Rani and Syrian would survive. The Cybermen would leave the planet, and within minutes the wind would have redesigned the landscape, brushing away all trace of anybody's presence. The planet would be as chill and blighted as it had ever been, almost as if the planet wanted it that way.